Bill O'Reilly and the right-wing media have something in common with New York City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly. They seem to know what's best for the lives of young black men. For them, black-on-black crime is never an extremely significant or complicated issue or a sharp condemnation of poverty. Instead, it's about how young black men have failed to understand that this is a nation of laws. And that's one of the reasons why Ray Kelly is out there defending New York's Stop-and-Frisk program, which stops hundreds of thousands of men, most of them black or brown, even though very few of those stops lead to actual charges. Now, Kelly's name has been floated to replace Janet Napolitano as the head of the Department of Homeland Security. But he's now on a charm offensive after critics have called attention to the dramatic disconnect between Kelly's record and the national conversation on racial profiling we're having in the wake of the Zimmerman verdict. Today, in a piece he wrote for the Wall Street Journal, Kelly said that the practice stop and frisk saves lives. In the 11 years before Mayor Michael Bloomberg took office, there were 13,212 murders in New York City. During the 11 years of administration, there have been 5,849. That's 7,383 lives saved. And if history is a guide, they are largely the lives of young men of color. Never mind the fact that violent crime, not just here in New York, but nationwide, has been declining since 1990. And never mind the fact some cities saw their violence decrease by doing the exact opposite of stop and frisk and relied on, quote, close cooperation between the police and the community that have ended up improving race relations. In fact, the Wall Street Journal, the very same paper in which he raved about the success of stop and frisk, ran a piece saying that a 50% decrease in the number of stop and frisks coincided with a 30% decline in murder in New York, which doesn't make a lot of sense if the number of frisks is the thing that determines the murder rate. The case against stop and frisk was once quite nicely summed up by a former NYPD commissioner who observed a large reservoir of goodwill was under construction when I left the police department in 1994. It was called community policing. But it was quickly abandoned for tough-sounding rhetoric and dubious stop-and-frisk tactics that sowed new seeds of community mistrust. That man, of course, was Ray Kelly. If there were a way to nominate that guy to DHS, I'd be all for it. Joining me now is New York City Councilwoman Letitia James, a Democrat who is running for public advocate in New York, and Brian Stevenson, founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, a professor at the New York University School of Law. Councilwoman, I'll begin with you. The argument is 7,000 lives have been saved. What's your problem? Do you wish those people were dead instead?
It's really not the case. We should not be looking at these policies through the lens of how many lives have been saved, but it should be based on whether or not they're legal and whether or not they comport to the Constitution of the United States of America and whether or not we're violating the rights primarily of young black and brown people.
But here's the argument that's made, that the people in the neighborhoods you represent worry about crime and want to see the police do something about it, and this is what the police are doing. And in fact, that if you look at polling in this city, Ray Kelly has a fairly high approval rating. He has a fairly high approval rating among African Americans in the city. That this is delivering the goods, and this is essentially just carping from the side of critics.
Since I'm on the ground, the vast majority of the constituents that I represent, New Yorkers overall, have informed me that they want more smart policing, that they want community policing, that they would like a police officer on the beat, a police officer that they can trust. They recognize that stopping and frisking men of color in the city of New York sows the seeds of distrust.
Brian, the thing that I think links what Bill O'Reilly had to say on his program last night and Ray Kelly's defense of his record is the idea that the best thing you can do for young African American men, young African Americans in general, is have a very intense law and order state that is very aggressive about policing and putting wrongdoers in jail, because the victims of those wrongdoers are themselves African American, and you have spent your adult career working in the criminal justice system. My question to you is, does that argument have purchase with you?
No, it really doesn't. It's a distraction. Trayvon Martin wasn't killed because he didn't have two parents who loved him. He wasn't killed because of some social deficit or some cultural deficit. He was killed because of a presumption of guilt. And what happened to him, and what's happening in New York, and what's happening all over this country, is that we are actually allowing black and brown children to be burdened with this presumption of guilt so that they live their whole lives always being suspected, always being feared. We had the President of the United States, who's achieved more than any African American, acknowledging his own dealings with this presumption of guilt. And not only does it create distrust, it actually creates division. When anyone says that's not a problem, when anyone says that you should just learn to tolerate that, you're actually feeding this history of distrust. and abuse and presumptions of danger and all of these things that mark the African American experience in this country. And we will not recover until we address this.
What's remarkable to me is that the hidden truth behind all of this, behind the stop-and-frisk conversation, when we're talking about profiling and about suspicion and black-on-black crime, which is this phrase that I think has a really ugly undercurrent to it, is the fact that a miracle has happened in this country, is that the crime rate has gone down incredibly across all kinds of different cities, in all kinds of different environments, and that, I have to say, has produced really tangible benefits. I'm a lifelong New Yorker, I know you are as well, right? It does make a big difference that there's a lot less crime in New York now.
But it's not tied to the abuse of stop and frisk. The reality is that crime is down for a number of reasons. The trajectory of violent crime in our country has been going down since the 1990s, since the epidemic of the crack industry in the city of New York and throughout this country. And in addition to that, in the city of New York, we've had more community policing and we've had more community-based organizations involved in the lives of primarily black and brown people in the city of New York. So crime has gone down, again, but there's no correlation between crime going down and the abuse and stop and frisk.
And Brian, the criminal justice system you navigate every day as a lawyer was created by politics that happened largely in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when crime was much higher, and yet we have vestigial laws and suspicion from that era.
Well, that's right. And we can't, the metric isn't just crime alone. I mean, we had 300,000 people in jails and prisons in 1972. 2.3 million people in jails and prisons today. Our prison population has continued to increase as these rates have gone down. I mean, in this century, a black child born in 2001 has a 32% chance of going to jail or prison compared to a white child, a white boy, with a 6% chance. Wow. That's horrific. And it creates a new issue for this country to deal with. And we have to understand the seriousness of that.
New York City Councilwoman Letitia James and Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative, thank you both for coming tonight.